Mark DiPlacido, Mr. Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Um, I'll be talking about the economic problems of our time and especially of America. I would like to start perhaps with the notion of free trade. After the end of the Second World War, the United States embraced free trade more decisively than ever before, when it used to be a protectionist nation for a long time. Do you see that shift as being driven primarily by political or purely economic reasons?
Yes, that's a great question, a great place to start. So, like you said, the American tradition largely was protectionist from the very earliest days of the country. The first bill that the United States Congress ever passed was a tariff. That started to change. There was always a bit of a division between Democrats and Republicans. For a long time, Democrats were heavily agrarian and Southern. Because they mainly dealt in commodities. They favored free trade because they were more concerned about exports and didn't want to pay more for domestic imports. So there was sort of a regional conflict for a long time. Republicans really dominated politically after the Civil War, but early in around the time of World War I, our president Woodrow Wilson was pretty stridently free trade and started to link the idea between free trade and broader domestic interests. Whereas before there was always a much clearer connection between protectionism and American interests. And there was this theory that if nations traded freely, that it would naturally result in peace. And there was a sort of follower of this idea named Cordell Hull, who became Secretary of State under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president during World War II. And he ended up building a lot of the infrastructure that became the world trade and economic system. What's, I think, really important to understand coming out of World War II were two sort of geopolitical factors that heavily influenced political support for sort of the free trade system. The first was that the United States was a very dominant manufacturing power, especially after most of its trading partners were decimated during the war. Most European economies and Asian economies were, completely unable to pick up manufacturing where it was 5 years before the war had started. The US, I think, accounted for over 50% of worldwide manufacturing, and immediately following the war was also close to 50% of world GDP. Now we're about 25% of world GDP today, and manufacturing share has fallen to 16% as a share of global manufacturing. So economically, we're in a much different position. The second major factor to keep in mind is that this already starting, the Cold War was already starting. And there was a lot of fear among American intelligence that if Europe's economy became destabilized and there was sort of more economic feuding and tension and beggar thy neighbor policies among European countries that the world saw after World War One and during the Great Depression in the 1930s, more countries might be liable to fall to communism. And trade was also seen as an opportunity to invite more third countries and developing countries into the West's orbit and away from the Soviet Union. So while you did have this idea that global trade relations, most favored nation treatment for everybody would yield peace, that was sort of undermined by the immediate idea that the West was going to form a trade bloc and there would be spheres of influence between the West and the Soviet Union. I think the way that's sort of developed and more relevant in modern times is China, which was actually an original signer of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which laid the foundation for what would later become the World Trade Organization in 1994, was an original signer. It was an ally of the Western power or the Allied powers during World War II, but fell to communism in 1949, 2 years after that agreement was signed. So it pretty immediately suspended trade relations. There was some fluctuation between that period in 2001, but eventually China was allowed permanent normal trade relations by the United States, entry into the World Trade Organization in 2000 and 2001, and that ended up spurring a lot of the dominant conversation in the United States today about trade imbalances as China's surplus massively grew and the United States deficit massively grew.
There is a strategic reason profoundly for the United States to turn to more free trade during the Cold War, if I'm listening to you, especially to keep to counter communist influence. And yet, the United States expanded free trade even more after the end of the Cold War, with NAFTA, with the entering, letting China enter the WTO. What do you think that is? How do you explain that?
Yeah, so my argument or my thesis, and I should have a paper coming out on this actually next week, that kind of lays out a lot of this history, is that basically what started off as a policy that could be argued on grounds of sort of national interests and realpolitik and balance of power sort of calcified into this more ideological position that if we're just to open markets and to suspend trade protections, that other countries will democratize, they'll follow suit, and we'll sort of see, as Francis Fukuyama put it, an end of history as countries move closer and closer to liberal democracy, free market capitalism. I think just from a geopolitical standpoint, that narrative has really fallen apart as China has sort of remained and become even more authoritarian. It's deliberately steered a lot of industrial subsidies and its national economic policy at gaining world market share at the expense of its trading partners. That's opened up a lot of national security vulnerabilities for the United States. But I would now say with the critical mineral situation, the entire world really, because it's really cornered about 90% of refining of that industry that goes into everything from batteries to military equipment to electronics, that sort of thing. And then secondly, I think there was always, as I mentioned at the beginning, this sort of regional and sort of economic tension within the country on what trade policy is best for different sectors of the economy, different classes of the economy, people who own businesses and own capital, and people who are workers and laborers. And what I think we've seen with globalization is that a lot of multinational corporations have sought growth by cutting costs and trimming business expenses rather than investing and actually growing and expanding. And that includes expanding wages and productivity. The U.S. has seen since the early 90s its trade deficit go from a $30 billion deficit to now $1 trillion a year. Alongside of that, productivity has been flat in the manufacturing sector since 2010, which is a very bad indicator for an advanced economy like the United States. Industrial production has basically been flat since 2000. So the overall output of industrial goods has completely flatlined. And that was after it still doubled between 1980 and 2000. So there definitely was a slowdown in growth of manufacturing before China was let into the WTO, but that really accelerated, and the job losses in the United States have also accelerated. And what I think people see on a more individual level is a lack of the same opportunities to build stable middle class families, especially on a single income. We put out a report that sort of tracks the basic basket of goods that a middle class family would think of for having security. Things like healthcare, education, and sort of a broader bucket. In 1985, it took the typical male head of household 40 hours to afford that basket of goods. That's gone up to 62 weeks now, which of course is more weeks than there are in a year. So the opportunities have really shrunk. And then as a result, there's also been more concentration of wealth and more concentration of economic opportunities in sort of major metropolitan areas, especially on the coasts that are closer to transatlantic trade and trans-Pacific trade. And that's ultimately resulted in a major surge in deaths of despair in the United States. And it was so severe that it actually brought down the life expectancy of the overall country for 3 years, at least in the 2010s. And the average gap in life expectancy between Americans with a college degree, which are still 2/3 of our population, and people with a college degree is 8.5 years. So people who have a college degree in the United States who typically go into jobs that benefit from globalization, are living nearly a decade longer than people who are not. So there's been a very uneven distribution of the benefits of globalization.
Um, American Compass, which you're, I think, a member of, if I'm not mistaken, has often been described as emblematic of a broader evolution within American conservatism, with shifting away from libertarian orthodoxy toward maybe a more interventionist and community-oriented economic vision. Uh, Actually, what you just said is very heterodox for the right wing. There you have a class analysis partly to not analyze these phenomenons. So, how would you characterize this transformation, and what distinguishes this kind of new right economics from like Reagan era conservatism, for instance?
Yes. So I think sort of going back to the frame of reference that people had in the 1970s and 1980s was heavily influenced by the geopolitical reality of the fight between the West and communism, right? And I think intellectually that sort of bled into economic thought and economic theory in a way that painted things as black and white in terms of private versus public sector. And so anything that became more interventionist, or we would argue laid rules and barriers to the economy, became more and more simply conflated with the sort of managerial, socialist and communist tendencies that the United States and the West were fighting against. I think what that ended up doing is dismissing American history really before World War II, which, as I mentioned, had always seen a role for government to set the right parameters and ensure that the market is moving in line with the national interests. And I think there's obviously more and less efficient ways to regulate the market. I think American Compass, and I think really anybody on the right in the United States still is not wholesale dismissive of capitalism. I think it's been a matter of taking stock. The economy should serve the country. The country's interests do not come second to economic interests. And I think as globalism has expanded, or companies have become more global, that impulse to maximize profits or maximize shareholder returns has at times come at the expense of broader national interests, and I think it eventually has met political opposition on both the left and the right now in the United States.
Um, Looking ahead, do you think a second Trump administration, the current administration, is doing enough to develop a serious industrial strategy? And do you think that tariffs alone are sufficient, or that the US needs a more perhaps a systemic approach to rebuilding productive capacity within the US?
Yeah, so we at American Compass really have a pretty broad view of the tools and strategies that are going to be necessary to fully complete the project. I think it's important to I got to use the metaphor, like you can't fill the bathtub until you plug the drain. I think if we didn't have tariffs, right, any industrial subsidies we would try to use to rebuild our own, or the additional training that we're trying to get to our workers and our population, you would still have those market incentives to go to countries that crush their own consumers and suppress wages and offer subsidies for foreign companies to come in so that they can steal their intellectual property, right? So I do think as a first wave, tariffs are really important to both kind of stop the bleeding and allow the tub to fill, and also to send the right market signals that companies need to adjust their business strategies and their investment strategies to start rebuilding here. And I think the pledged investments that the United States has had, I mean, I've seen numbers, anywhere from 7 to 19 trillion now. Some people in the administration are saying of businesses and foreign countries pledging to invest and increase production capacity in the United States. So there's already been, I think, some great initial incentives, but we would add to that at American Compass the need for industrial financing for scaling, especially larger and more capital intensive industries, which is sort of another component, I think, of capitalism. Maybe I would mention that ties to your last question as well. I think in the 80s and historically in the United States, most people affiliate capitalism with small businesses, entrepreneurship, innovation, inventors that have sort of an immediate localized impact, right? And as capitalism has become multinational, it's become more opaque, and people see less of the immediate benefits. And another reason for that is sort of the incentives inherent in shareholder capitalism in particular. So typically, people think that businesses can be successful just by netting profits. To get capital in the United States now, a lot of companies, especially for more capital intensive industries, investors are looking for 7-15% returns, and they're looking for it as soon as possible. And so industries that are going to require, building a factory, which with permitting and all the other regulations they have to get through, can take 10 to 15 years. We've made it very uneconomical in the United States to build and to manufacture. And so lowering energy prices, lowering regulations, which our policies supported still across the right, and increasingly even on the left, as there's been recognition that even getting green energy projects off the ground has been really difficult with a lot of our regulations and permitting. Those are still important. And then I would say the last piece is reskilling and reaccommodating both businesses and the broader population, that there is going to be a need for these skills that we have walked away from in a very imprudent way for the last 30 years. And so I do think it's going to take some time for people to recognize that, no, there are going to be much better opportunities in manufacturing. There's going to be better opportunities in local industry than there have been the last 30 years. It will be a mindset shift, and it's going to require a lot of investment as well. So we do see a role for government playing a more active role in those programs and in coordinating with the private sector to make sure projects, especially that are necessary for our national security, get off the ground.
Recently, Washington lowered certain tariffs, and China suspended export restrictions on rare earths for a year, which is a kind of ceasefire in the trade war, I guess, between China and the US. How do you interpret this development, and what do you think it reveals about the current balance of power between both countries?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think it indicates to me that it's going to take some time for the United States to build the capacity it needs to compete with China, right? I think it's been, in our view, 35 years of sort of rowing in the wrong direction, building the wrong incentives into our economy, and allowing these strategic industries to move to China and to offshore. And it's a relationship that we believe is sort of unsustainable, and we have a paper called A Hard Break from China that sort of outlines a lot of our views and arguments as to why. But we also recognize that relationship cannot be ended overnight, and that ideally these policies that are going to restrict trade with China, investment in China, especially in strategic sectors, are in a lot of cases going to have to be implemented tactically and gradually to unhook our economies in a way that's sustainable, and that also doesn't touch off broader conflict, which President Trump, I think, is pretty keen on avoiding. So I think that it can be painted as a setback, and certain elements of it are are maybe disappointing to people who are more hawkish on the Chinese relationship. But I think there's a way to also see it that this could be a timing and a prudence thing as well.
NVIDIA's relatively conciliatory stance towards China seems at odd with Washington's broader strategic posture. Um, do you see this as a contradiction with within Trump's approach, or what do you attribute this to? Why is NVIDIA able to do what they're currently doing with their pretty, I think, soft stance? I think it's safe to say towards China.
Yeah, I think it's something that we've really looked at very critically NVIDIA's behavior. That they are opening a joint research institute in China, that they are clearly intent on selling all of these chips to China. Um, that's sort of one of the last major advantages that the United States has, is our ability to design and manufacture these chips, obviously with the help of some of our trading partners as well. And so giving away what will be very definitive technology for the 21st century, and technology that has obvious immediate military applications, I just think should be totally off the negotiating table. And it's we American Compass just put a paper out last week on it's called "Stop Selling the Rope," and it outlines a lot of other industries that the United States has sort of done this, where Tesla and Apple have built out entire supply chains in China, trained a lot of Chinese workers on not just their technologies but their business practices. And what we consistently see is that China then harvests that technology. They share it with other domestic competitors, and then they slowly push the American company out of the market altogether. So it's there just does not seem an upside at all to the United States. And Nvidia is the number one stock in the world right now, setting records. But that really should bear no relationship to the decisions that policymakers make in the national interest of the country. That's the way we see it at American Compass, for sure.
If the US were to retreat from its post-Cold War role as the global hegemon, do you foresee a transition toward the genuinely multipolar world order defined in terms of spheres of influence? And don't you think that there is possibly a risk that this approach, and also Trump's approach of sometimes treating European and Asian allies on par with China, could perhaps erode America's natural sphere of influence with the Europe and the Asian allies?
I think there are people, very, very, influential and thoughtful people on the right who have recognized, aside from the normative question, just from a factual basis, is the United States entering a multipolar era again? And I think more and more people, especially on the new right, are recognizing that we are. The Secretary of State Marco Rubio has given speeches to this effect. Our founder Orrin Cass had a really insightful essay in Foreign Affairs a week or two ago called "A Grand Strategy of Reciprocity" that I would highly recommend to any of the people watching the video, that sort of lays out why I think we're coming to this moment. And the reality is that the United States does not have the market position, the economic strength, the geopolitical bandwidth that it had in 1945 when the rest of the world was destroyed, right? And I would say we're behind even where we were at the end of the Cold War in 1989. And so as these new conflicts have come online, as the U.S. debt has risen to $36 trillion, I think the last of three major credit agencies in the United States have now downgraded our debt. We have a lot of polarization in our country. We have a lot of people hurting in our country from lack of opportunities. There's less and less of an appetite domestically to uh, worry about the world, and pretend that we can still call balls and strikes and do as much as we could 100 years ago. And that obviously has trade-offs, right? I mean, it's great to be on top. It's great to be the unchallenged leader, but realistically, no nation, no civilization has ever held on to that level of power forever. And our tradition in America has always been as a republic, not as an empire. And I think a lot of people, especially on the new right and some of the more influential people in the current administration, uh, are ready to say we need our allies to take on more responsibility themselves. We can't extend the global shield across the entire world anymore, and other countries are going to have to start contributing more and being more self sufficient.
Um, Given the political importance of the affordability theme and lowering living costs ahead of perhaps of the midterms, do you think that there is a risk that the Trump administration may be tempted to scale back some of the tariffs for domestic economic reasons or political reasons, I should say, even at the expense of the strategic consistency?
I I think that some people, there are still plenty of influential people on the old right here. I think that most of this administration, if you look at the key appointments, um, really look a lot more like they believe in the ideas of American Compass, and sort of the more of the ideology, and it's not the ideology, more of the ideas and principles that President Trump campaigned and ran on, right? So I think there would be people probably who advocate for that. I think it would be strategically a massive mistake to walk away, because I think our trade deficit plays into so many of the economic problems uh, that plague the country. And tariffs, I mean, if the problem is inflation, right? Um, Tariffs are they're taxes, and they take money out of the economy, right? And we really have not seen the surge of inflation that a lot of people promised we would see back in April. It's really been pretty moderate, and uh, imports are also only 15% of the equivalent of 15% of our GDP. So we're still looking at a relatively small sector of the economy for the United States that is being hit with additional fees. But most of the impact that we've had already has been pretty minor. And what we need to do is make sure we keep people employed and start raising wages. And if wages start rising faster than prices, then I mean, that's even better.
Um, some have attributed the moderation of inflation to perhaps the growth of AI, the AI sector. Do you think that this is true, or there is some validity to it, or no?
It seems like there are more and more studies that come out on that every day. We've seen studies that sort of go both ways. That there really hasn't been an increase in productivity shown at a lot of corporations yet, um, but other ones are more rosy. I wouldn't say that I think there's been great gains yet, and I also wouldn't jump the gun and say that maybe a lot of the firings are going to be the rule. So I don't know. Maybe I don't want to cop out of the question, but I haven't made up my mind on how dire of a situation or how positive of a situation we're going to have from AI. But it's obviously going to play a major role in the coming years.
Understand. Um, That being said, there seems to be perhaps a tension between Trump's push for reindustrialization of America, which is also the agenda, I think, of American Compass. So basically, restoring stable, productive jobs for American families, and thereby remaking an healthy social fabric for the U.S. But also with this close alignment with uh, the AI sector, the Silicon Valley's sector, especially on AI, which could make potentially human labor obsolete. At least that's what they some of them want, and that's what AI aims to. AI aims to. So, do you see this as an internal contradiction in the project of the new right? How can you reindustrialize and give more productive jobs to Americans if AI has taken it all away?
So I think our founder Orrin Cass had a great essay. I think it's Two Cheers for Automation, and the organization put out a symposium. I think it's an 8 or 10 part series on this exact question of whether we should fear productivity increases, whether there's a natural tension between benefits to labor and sort of increases in productivity, like the classic example of the Luddites smashing the machines. And our argument, I think, is that we can see a healthy adoption of productivity increases if companies choose to give labor a seat at the table and work through the technological changes together. I think also you should see a rise. If we're seeing a rise in output alongside rises in productivity, then we shouldn't have a net decrease in labor either. So I think historically there have been waves of fears in every stage of the industrial revolution that the next technology is going to wipe out jobs. Historically, that really hasn't panned out. Obviously, we haven't seen quite what AI is going to do yet, but on the whole, I would say we remain more optimistic on the question.
Um, if the US truly wants to rebuild a productive and perhaps export-oriented economy rather than one based on consumption and imports, uh, doesn't it need to maybe confront the what we call the Triffin dilemma and perhaps even reconsider the global dominance of the dollar? I think that's what, for instance, Stephen Mirren used to defend. What do you think about that?
Yes. So as part of my series that hopefully will be coming out next week, I have a piece examining sort of the capital account side of the trade balance as well, and a lot of these currency questions. And if you look back at sort of the progression of the history of American trade policy as well, we really started seeing the first deficits just as the United States came off the gold standard in 1971. And that essentially eliminated the natural adjustment mechanism between currencies that kept trade in balance. So we are one of the organizations that is comfortable pointing out that a stronger dollar, while it helps some industries and some sectors, it maybe allows the U.S. to project some growth being or project some power being the reserve currency. It can't come at the expense of our industrial competitiveness, and there are also downsides and risks of having a dollar that remains strong, sort of no matter what. So we are, as an alternative to tariffs, we've suggested the idea of a market access charge, which would be placed on investment coming into the country. That would work on the capital side. There's also been some discussion of using a sovereign wealth fund, which a lot of surplus countries use around the world. The United States does not have a surplus, so we would have to fund it in another way. But using that to maybe try to purchase other currencies to bring the U.S. dollar into alignment, and other proposals as well. But I think that conversation is just beginning in Washington, D.C. It's something, the relationship between trade and currency policy is something that the United States really hasn't recognized since the Plaza Accords in the mid 80s. But there is plenty of historical precedent for countries to come together and say the currencies are out of whack, the trade is imbalanced as a result of it. We cannot have predatory devaluations. We have to restore balance. And doing something like that again, like President Reagan did in 1985, when the trade deficit really first started to go up, ended up being very effective. It did bring the trade deficit down in the United States, but it wasn't a permanent solution. And Japan sort of faded as an issue for a while, but China obviously took its place, and a lot of other Southeast Asian nations are as well. So that's definitely a relevant and an important part of the conversation going forward. I would say that it's a conversation that's just starting though.
Um, isn't there a danger that in trying to perhaps restructure the global trade and assert greater sovereignty, that the US could perhaps alienate its allies to such a degree that it uh, accelerates China's rise as a kind of alternative center of gravity in the global economy?
Yeah, so I think the advantage that the United States has there is that it runs a deficit with almost all of its major allies and trade partners. It's got a pretty even balance with a lot of the Anglosphere countries and Brazil, but most of its other trading partners it runs significant deficits with as well. So in that case, if other countries have built their economic models on exports and China has hyper built its economy on exports, those are not going to be natural pairings the way that the U.S. economy is with our other partners. And I would say, and we've already seen this, that as the United States has pulled back and as we've put higher tariffs and more trade barriers in place, Chinese goods have started flooding other markets. And I think that there might be people that want to make the same decisions and mistakes that the United States made 30 years ago, um, and let these goods in without restrictions, but it's going to end up hollowing out their manufacturers the same way it did here. And you can see this already happening in countries like Germany, right? There's a scholar at I believe Council on Foreign Relations named Brad Setzer. I think he worked in the U.S. Trade Rep's office in the Biden administration, but he has a paper on sort of what's being called the second China shock. That's really had a much bigger effect on economies like Germany, because since China announced Made in China 2025 10 years ago, it's targeted a lot more of the sectors that Germany's economy has depended on. Whereas the first China shock took things that the United States was strong in, like consumer electronics, furniture, um, things like that. Germany's been very dominant in autos, obviously, green technology, heavy manufacturing, and those are the areas that China has targeted now. So I I think that there's going to be natural resistance to change, especially when, from our view, it's been a pretty good arrangement for trade partners. We've absorbed a lot of their goods, we've paid for a lot of their defense, um, and there's going to be pain in adjusting. But the system was unsustainable. It remains unsustainable, and I don't think China is going to be a safe set of arms for other countries to run into.
Mark DiPlacido, thank you very much for sharing your insights with me. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
You as well. Thank you so much for having me.